Hi, folks. Lou here to talk about the collapse of armies. Now, this topic came up because some people expect the Russian armies in Ukraine to collapse as a way for Ukraine to end the war. So I thought to myself, what would this look like? And do we have historical precedents? First, keep in mind that in war, quote, the moral is to the physical as 3:1, unquote. That's Napoleon himself. Morale is very important. We have a lot of examples of armies collapsing at a single battle, a battle that takes a day or two, but few examples of an entire army collapsing in a war. It's psychological. It's not a matter of numbers of men and tanks and planes, although the larger the army, the less likely it is to totally collapse. Now, in commercial war games, morale tends to be ignored because it can be so chaotic. It can be so drastic that players who want to control their own fate feel that they are not when something happens with morale and suddenly a large part of their army runs away. Now, I'm talking about board war games or computer war games. Now, miniatures war games usually include morale as a very important factor. In fact, perhaps the most important factor. So this varies with the format that you're using. So what happens in these situations is a leader falls and suddenly an entire army breaks and flees. Or a unit shows up behind an army and is mistaken for the enemy when it's actually reinforcements and the army flees. This is something that you can find many examples of in history. But what about modern size armies collapsing, armies of millions rather than 100,000 or less? It's unusual, quite unusual, that armies of that size collapse. Did the Russian army in 1917 collapse? Well, they had the first revolution, the socialist revolution, and they stayed in the war. But then they had the Bolshevik or communist revolution, and they sued for peace. I have not studied this period sufficiently to know how well the Russian army was doing, although in general I know it was doing badly, but I don't know that it collapsed. The big example of an entire army of modern size, let's say, collapsing is the Germans in 1918. They nearly captured Paris, but then that didn't work out, and more Americans turned up, and the blockade was having a greater and greater effect on Germany, and suddenly the German army was just running for the hills. Now, could they have recovered from that? I don't know, because their governments sued, and that included the top generals, sued for an armistice. And a year later, they had a peace treaty, or perhaps more than a year later, and Germany was done. So that's the classic example. And I suspect that's what people figure might happen to Russia in the Ukraine. Now, another example from World War II, did Italy collapse? I don't know the details, but I suspect the Italian government figured out that they were on the wrong side and they needed to get out of that mess, and they did. I don't know that the Italian armies themselves collapsed. Now, consider the Japanese in World War II. They were ready to fight on even after the atomic bombs were dropped. It was in large part the emperor who finally said, no, we can't do this and have all our people die. And he convinced the people who wanted to fight on. If they'd fought on, an awful lot of Americans would have died in the invasion of Japan, hundreds of thousands probably, but the atomic bombs prevented that. Nonetheless, the point is the Japanese were ready to fight on. The Germans in World War II fought on until to ridiculous extents, putting kids in the army, fighting when the Russians were in Berlin, fighting when the Allies, Western Allies, had come into Germany. And they kept fighting. It didn't even make sense, but they kept fighting. So I'm a bit skeptical about modern armies collapsing. Will the Russians do so? Well, given that history I've just showed you, I suspect not. But certainly, segments of the Russian army have already shown that they can collapse temporarily, as happened in Kharkiv, the Kharkiv offensive of the Ukraine, when the Russians just left their equipment behind and headed for the hills. That can happen to a segment of an army. The doubt in my mind is that an entire army can give up that way. Well, thanks for listening.